In this module, we are going to discuss how to develop a checklist for compilations. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, follow professional standards, and document what we have done properly. Now, I think you can also take this module more generally for how to develop a checklist for any engagement. And I think the general principles are, if the section says this is something you must document, you're going to document something, and generally a little more than you otherwise would. Other things, like the section says the practitioner shall understand the entire text of the section. You might, if you felt like it, just have a checklist question that says, I understood the entire text. Or not. You could say, well, it doesn't say I have to document that, so I didn't. And the other thing to recall is, even in the auditing standards, the standards acknowledge that a checklist step, having a checklist that says I did this, is an acceptable way to document some things. Now, for instance, in the compilation section, we're supposed to have an understanding of the business. I don't think it's sufficient to say, I have an understanding of the business, tick. So you're going to have to make that decision at the level of documentation. Now, of course, we have to follow standards. And to some extent, the checklist is a reminder. There are certain things that I can recall that I would always forget to do. And so when I'm going through the checklist, I'm going, oh, good grief. Thanks very much for reminding me that I was supposed to do that. I shall do that, and I shall fill out the checklist steps saying I did it. And of course, we want to be efficient, so we want to think about how we can efficiently and effectively combine things so we only have to document them once. And for instance, particularly in the compilation and throughout standards, audit and review, the rep letter and the engagement letter are automatic documentation. If it says you shall ask the client about something and you have such a paragraph in the rep letter, that's the beginning and the end of it. Now, the only thing you might do is you might have a checklist step to say, in the rep letter, I asked the client, tick. And if somebody says, well, I need more documentation, you would say, read the rep letter. And as I said before, you're going to have a choice between having a blank box, the kind of business this enterprise is in, blank box, fill in the blank box. It's a restaurant. It's a retail store. And then you have to decide, is that enough for someone to understand? And I would submit that probably an experienced practitioner, if you're trying to explain what kind of business it is and you told them it was a restaurant, I would expect an experienced practitioner to know that. Or you have the choice of the I did this. So do we just have a blank box that requires staff to fill something out, or do we say I did this? Now, Section 41 is where it says this is the documentation that is required. So if you wished, you could go, this is all I'm doing. This is all I'm documenting. None of the other stuff that is required in the section has to be documented, and I'm only going to do this. Now, my inclination is to at least have a step to remind me to make sure that I did it, because I would like to do everything I'm supposed to do. So the documentation we accumulate in a compilation is supposed to be sufficient in the practitioner's judgment for an experienced practitioner to understand what was done. And so as you have your conclusion at the end in your checklist, you might say, in my judgment, this is sufficient for an experienced practitioner to understand. And then you've documented that. Now, the things that we have to document, you have to have an engagement letter. And of course you do, because the engagement letter is what you're going to produce in court when you try to argue that I didn't do an audit, I did a compilation. So very important that we have an engagement letter. So that should be the first question in our checklist. I check that the file contains an engagement letter. Then we have to document business operations, accounting system, and records, and the basis of accounting. Now, it's a compilation, so I think we can have a blank box. The kind of business the enterprise operates is a blank box. and the accounting system and records, blank box. And I think I would want to document the basis of accounting in the representation or even the engagement letter. And it's only a compilation, so we're going to have 2 blank boxes, and we're going to conveniently document the basis of accounting in the rep letter. We have to document that the accounting records agree to the financial information provided. So presumably the client has given us some financial information, a trial balance. We've made some journal entries, recorded depreciation, for instance, and that should do it. We have a client's opening trial balance. We have an adjusted trial balance. That agrees to the financial statements. Now, again, I think I would like to have a question to remind me to check to make sure that I didn't make a late entry and forget to record it, and that the client has agreed the journal entries with us. So there's 2 questions, and then I think I would duplicate the agreement that management has agreed with the adjustments we make, and I would have that in the rep letter. The rep management says we have approved the journal entries you have made. Okay? Significant judgments, if any. This is a dangerous question, and we'll talk about it more later, but if we assisted or discussed, it's starting to look like we've provided assurance, so we have to be very careful the words we use, and we have to make sure that management takes responsibility. So I would again repeat that in the rep letter, that if there were any, management takes full responsibility for it. So I have a question, and if we assisted with any significant judgments, we've documented it. If we have assisted with significant judgments, we'd better make sure that we've done enough work to make sure that those significant judgments are right. So suddenly we're departing from doing no work. We're assisting with a significant judgment, so we'd better do some work to make sure it's right. So in the rep letter and a question. Communication of misleading matters, if any. Again, same as the previous. I hope there are none. If there are any misleading matters, better have a question to remind us, and the misleading matters better be resolved. So I'm really hopeful. This is a compilation. It's supposed to be a simple client. There shouldn't be any misleading matters. We're supposed to have a copy of the financial information and management's acknowledgement of responsibility. Question 1, the file contains a copy of the financial information, and management's responsibility is in the rep letter. So a question and in the rep letter. Copy of the report, that's with question 6 above. So do we have a copy of our report and the financial information in the file? That's question 6. Question 7, reason for withdrawal. I've seen some people like to have a really long, complicated, detailed questionnaire about this. I think my answer would be it's either not applicable or we no longer wish to provide services to you. And I don't want to say much more than that, because anything more as you start to explain how terrible they've been, that just gives your client cause to sue you. So if you do want to write that down, you might even want to talk to a lawyer before you tell them why. And maybe you just say, I don't want to help you anymore. That's the 7th question. Now, we must document those things. It's not hard. We are documenting that we have documentation. We've got to be very careful throughout that our documentation makes it very clear that we're doing no work to give any assurance at all. So we're not going to use the word check or agree or any word that would be an audit word or review word. Compared, not doing any of that. And care and reluctance to either make a significant judgment or communicate misleading matters. Now, we've got to be careful on that. If we get the information from the client and we notice they haven't provided this with the allowance to full accounts like they always do, presumably you just phone them and say, hey, you forgot the allowance, and they go, oh, sorry about that, here it is. If there's something misleading and the client refuses to fix it, I think we quit, because there's just no way around it. If they're not going to fix it, we have no ability to qualify the compilation report. We just don't want to be involved anymore. We quit. Now, other principles. We don't want to document the same thing in more than one place. And in reviews, and particularly in audits, for instance, in an audit, I don't want to risk a material misstatement in 5 or 6 places, because we're going to forget it, and we're going to miss it, and we're not going to do anything about it. So it wastes time. We have the possibility of inconsistency. We say one thing in one place and one thing in another place. There's a possibility that we forget to respond to the issue, so we document that there's this big problem with management, and then we don't do anything about it because we resolved it, but we don't document that. I want to get management's agreement in one place, and again in the rep letter. So in the engagement letter and in the rep letter, I'll duplicate it. And if we say, have we obtained management's agreement about such and such, our answer will be, or the question will be, management's agreement to approve the journal entries is in the rep letter. We don't got to have a separate place where management documents that. One place, not 2. So a blank box or a long list. So I've seen some people, for the nature of the business, they will list every possible business that you could possibly be in. So that's going to take a long time, and it will probably get all filled out and wrong, and it will be filled out even if not needed. So I'm prepared to assume that my staff can use professional judgment and complete a blank box. If the blank box says, please describe the kind of business, I assume the staff can go, it's a restaurant. And training and supervision should be done to make sure that, and file review will make sure that that's done correctly. The other thing I do in my checklist is, if you satisfactorily complete every question, you initial and date it. And you don't have to initial and date in a compilation. You do in a review and an audit. It's very easy to make the checklist automatically initial and date. And if you initial and date and properly complete every checklist step, properly fill in every blank box, I have a big red X that remains until such time as everything's filled out and the big red X goes away. So you still have to review the file. You can't skip file review. You do have to look and see whether or not the blank box was filled out with "it's a restaurant" or the staff just went "NA", and that you put something in the box that makes no sense. You've completed the checklist step, but you haven't done it right. So the file reviewer will have to go through and see that the blank boxes are filled out correctly, but at least you don't have to stare at the checklist. And the longer the checklist is, the more likely it is that there's something not filled out and you don't notice it. So that's why I like the big red X. So what else might we document? And now we're going perhaps above and beyond. Paragraph 18 says we are supposed to understand the entire text. So question 8 can be, I did that. 19, comply with all requirements. And that I would put in the conclusion. We have already had 2 things we want in the conclusion, so in the conclusion I will, among other things, conclude that I complied with all requirements. Paragraph 20 is effectively the same as paragraph 19, so that fits in the conclusion as well. Comply with ethics and quality management things. Question 9, I did. I used professional judgment. That's also in 41. I did. Question 10. We followed ethics and quality management. I did. Question 11. Acceptance, intended use, and basis of accounting. Now, that's got to be in the engagement letter. The intended use, that there are or are not third parties. The basis of accounting, we'll talk more about that later. That's for the engagement letter. Who the third parties are, and that the client will provide them with information they request. Engagement letter. That we have agreed the terms of the engagement, automatically the engagement letter. And do we need to get a new one? Now, the standard lists either you get a new one or you answer 10 questions that would take 2 hours to properly answer. You can go tick, 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 but I think if you look at it, to actually answer those 10, or maybe it's 9 or 8, I don't know, questions, it would take you some time. So I think it's just simpler to get a new engagement letter every year. and say the one we have in last year's files for this year, and we're getting a new one this year, putting it in this year's file, and that's for next year. We prepared the financial information with a note describing the basis of accounting. That could be in the conclusion or a question. I like it better in the conclusion. We made any big judgment sets in 41.2, so hopefully none. That's question 3 from paragraph 41. We read and considered that it's not misleading. That's our conclusion. And we have to be careful. I considered it's not misleading. That's our conclusion. Not I considered it, not the words we use in an audit, reasonable, or the words we use in a review, nothing's come to my attention. Don't use any of those words in a compilation. We use I considered and it's not misleading. That's part of our conclusion. Matters coming to management's attention. I did that. Hopefully there are none. That's question 4. Withdrawal. That's paragraph 41 again. I did. I thought about that. Management to acknowledge their responsibility. That's in the rep letter and should be automatically in the rep letter. Facts that come to our attention after. I don't think we can put that in the checklist because we're going to complete the checklist as we complete the file and document. And if there was a question about that in the checklist, it would be open forever in the checklist. So I think we just have to remember that. I think it's unlikely. If this is a genuine compilation, we have contact with a client once in a year. And so it's really unlikely, and if something does happen, we'll just need to respond properly in that event. Form of the report, I drafted an appropriate report. I put an appropriate date on the report, both in the conclusion and the documentation in 41. We talked about that before. So there are 23 things, if I've counted right. We're reducing it to 10, or maybe it's 11 questions. 2 that remind us to fill out an engagement and a rep letter. We have 2 empty boxes. 6 things that we're supposed to do end up in the conclusion, and 4 things end up in the rep letter, and 4 things end up in the engagement letter. So we've made ourselves as efficient as we possibly can be and kept things to a minimum. Now remember, as we answer these questions, every single question, we are giving no assurance. Now, the work requirement between the new section and the old section is in fact unchanged. We didn't do any work before. We don't do any work now. Worked for the purpose of giving assurance. Now, all the new requirements are documentation. So we're required to prepare a whole bunch more documentation than we did before. So our focus should be on the rep and engagement letter, where the management takes responsibility for all this stuff and we don't. So, as I said before, care with significant judgments. I would prefer not to make significant judgments. I would prefer not to say that I made one. So we never want the file to indicate that we're taking responsibility or giving assurance. And so the wording has to sound as if we only help management make the call and no more. And if we are doing work like that, I guess we'd better do enough to make sure that we've given management the right way to make the call. Maybe all we do is provide them with a photocopy of an accounting handbook section. So I would prefer that to be not applicable. Most of my compilation engagements, maybe even all of them, there never were any significant judgments. They're very simple, very non-complex engagements. There weren't any. Care with misleading matters, and again I would prefer not to. And again, I would prefer if the client has not provided allowance for doubtful accounts. I don't think that's a misleading matter. That's just, hey, you forgot to give us this. You didn't give us the allowance. Please provide it. And normally the client wants us to fix all this. The client wants us to record depreciation, put in AFTA, do all that stuff, make the financial statements appropriate for the purpose intended, which is probably just to allow them to do a tax return. So even if I had to prompt them for AFTA, I would prefer to say not applicable. There were no misleading matters that I had to deal with. Now, if it gets to be a problem, if there start to be things that you've identified that are misleading, my preference now is quit. Just resign. If you don't, like, you hired us to put together with no assurance financial statements, to get us to tell you what we needed and to fix everything. And if there's something that you don't want us to fix or you don't want us to disclose, because typically you don't want me to disclose it because people might think something's wrong, automatically material, automatically a problem, automatically a third party that's being misled, quit. So we have to be very, very careful with this wording. Now, the basis of accounting has to be in the financial statements. And it has to appear as if management has told us. This is the basis of accounting that management picked. Now, to be very clear, I would prefer that that's repeated in the engagement and the rep letter and not anywhere in the file, because we don't need to do it 2 or 3 times. I guess I'm already doing it 2 times in the engagement and the rep letter. But in the engagement letter, they're telling us the basis that they've selected, and in the rep letter, they're confirming that that's appropriate for this year. And then we don't have to document it elsewhere. Now, one of the things that apparently is happening is some accountants are saying, well, the basis of accounting is Canadian Accounting Standards for Private Entities. Well, wow. If that's the case, then you have to have a statement of changes of financial position, you have to have full notes. And how do you know what notes you need? You have to have deferred taxes, because those standards require deferred taxes, and they require accounting for capital leases. And your client may go, I really don't care if it's a capital or operating lease, it's just for taxes. Tax authorities don't care whether it's capital or operating. They want me to account for it as if it is operating. So I just want, I'm on a cash basis using tax principles is all I want to do. So if we wanted to use accounting standards for private entities, that's a lot of work. How would we know? We'd have to draft full set of financial statements with all the notes. So that's not appropriate. And anyway, if we did that, I would say a third party, if we drafted financial statements with a full set of notes, I guess it would be reasonable that for them to assume that we'd done something to check that that was actually being used. And that we're providing assurance that accounting standards for private entities were being used. So certainly don't do that. Much too much work. Lots of legal exposure and lots of work, which you're probably not doing. So what then? Well, I would say something or other. I would have a note headed. This is all I would have. The only note. The basis of accounting selected by management, so that's pretty clear, by management. And management has selected the tax basis of accounting for the compiled financial information. Or you might say either the cash basis or the tax basis with certain accruals provided by management. Now the tax basis implies depreciation from the tax return. No need to mention accruals. We have done nothing. So I kind of prefer the first one. But I mean, I guess there might be accruals for receivables and payables. And then we might want to say, well, it's on a tax basis with certain accruals provided by management. Be a little more clear. But we're not implying any assurance. We're not implying that management provided an accrual. We have no idea whether it's right or not. Now, the engagement letter, really important. Management has to advise of third-party use. And the one thing that's kind of not mentioned is when we get the engagement letter, and it really doesn't matter when we get it, there may be no third-party use. But between the time we get the engagement letter, even if we get it at the beginning of the engagement, by the time we issue the report, maybe a third party has popped up. So we do have to have management advise us of current known third-party use, but I would also like us to get management to agree that they will advise us any time a third party appears. And that if a third party appears that's not known at the time the letter's signed, they will also give those new third parties all the information they need. So I would add that to the engagement letter to be double clear. The representation letter, if the entity is less complicated, we get the engagement letter at the beginning and we get the rep letter at the end. And so I believe it's useful to emphasize things in the rep letter that are also in the engagement letter that was at the beginning. And seeing we'll have a standard engagement letter and a standard rep letter, with no particular additional work to do it twice. And we'll make sure that those are always the same. Now, the representation letter, I would acknowledge again the responsibility for fraud and error and in the financial information, that management is responsible for that. Management again acknowledges that there's no assurance. Again, acknowledge the known third-party use and any new third parties. Acknowledge the accounting basis again, that they have approved the journal entries, and repeat anything about significant judgments, that we didn't make any, you made them. Now, the report. I have some problems with the report. It's called a compilation engagement report. So it looks just like an audit report or a review engagement report. So if I'm a third party reading this, I'm going, oh, gee, it's an auditor review kind of. There's an addressee, again, just like in the auditor review. So there's someone to whom we're responsible. Though some people argue that the only people that can rely on an audit report are the people to whom it is addressed. So maybe that helps. We say that we compiled it. Now that sounds good. It implies kind of that we did something, but we did nothing. We identify the financial information and the date of the financial information, just like an audit. We identify the basis of accounting. That sounds good. We say that management's responsible. Well, that's just the same as an audit. That we follow standards. So that sounds like we've done something, except if you understand the standards require no work for giving assurance. The standards only require documentation of documentation. We say we followed ethical standards. Well, there are almost no ethical standards that apply to a compilation, other than we have to disclose if we're not independent, if we own the company, which I wouldn't want to do a compilation on a company I owned anyway. That we helped management. Sounds like we're giving assurance. We did not do an auditor review. That sounds good so far. Sounds like we've done something really good here. And then at the end of the last sentence, we say we've given no assurance. And then we say may not be useful to third parties. Well, that helps. But all the way up to those two sentences, it sounds like we're doing an audit. And then we sign and date it and have an address. It looks just like we did an audit. So the standard setters have made it look as much like an audit report as possible, and by implication that we've done the kind of work we would have done in an audit. So I'm going to expect that sooner or later there are going to be some unhappy third parties that are going to sue on the basis of this report and say, well, you provided assurance. Now, the danger of getting sued. Even under the old NTR standard, accountants still got sued. And the problem is what a lawyer would call waiver of notice. And a notice to reader, that's a legal phrase. Hey, reader, take notice. You can't take any assurance. So what would happen is the bank would phone you. Say, hey, we've got your notice to reader here. We just have a few questions for you. Can you tell me about this? Can you tell me about that? What about this? What about that? Did they do this? Did they do that? If you talk to them, you're effectively waiving notice, and they can then sue you. So the bank phones and says, hey, you did this compilation engagement. We have some questions. Sorry, I have no idea the answer to any of your questions. I did not do any work. I am providing no assurance. Have to talk to management. Don't talk to me. Leave me alone. I can give you no assurance. I can answer none of your questions. If you want to ask questions, phone management. And then maybe when management phones you, you might help management because they don't know the answers. But don't talk to the bank, because that will constitute waiver of notice just the same way it did under the old notice to reader. Now, the other dangers, making it look like we help pick the accounting policy. And if the accounting policy says it's accounting standards for private entities or generally accepted accounting principles, well, then I guess we had to do something to make sure that they really did follow generally accepted accounting principles and had all the note disclosure required about everything. So we don't want to have an accounting policy that makes it look like we gave assurance. And we don't want to help with significant matters, and we don't want to help with misleading matters. So we have to be very careful if we are doing any of those last two things, to make sure that none of the wording in the file makes it look like we're giving assurance. Or if we have helped resolve a significant matter, well, then we have to have done enough work, like in an audit, to make sure we got the right answer and bill the client accordingly. And suddenly it stops becoming a pure compilation. So take great care. So I would always be reluctant to do a compilation if there are third parties. I would just be reluctant. It used to be that they would tell you not to do a notice to reader if there were third parties. Practice inspectors would say, you can't do a compilation, there are third parties. Now the compilation is directed purely to the needs of third parties. So I'm even more reluctant now to do it if there's a third party. Just don't. So take great care with the wording, and I don't know if there's a third party involved and they phone you. I guess you just restrict yourself. Please understand, we did not do an audit. We did not do a review. We provided no assurance of any kind whatsoever, no matter what the report looks like or what misleading impression you got from the report. We've done no work. We have no idea whether the numbers are right or not. We were asked to put this together from a trial balance from the client so they could do a tax return. That's it. Got no idea. So, thanks for listening.